Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink. It is time for some PathOfExile 2 discussion. Today, this is going to be one of my most important tip and trick videos for newer players. This is probably something that you'd work out some of yourself, but it's a really important system you want to engage with from early in the game. Unlike other guides I'm putting out during early access, it's going to be available in text form on gaming strategy site Mobalytics. Link to that down in the description below. This is how to get by without any equivalent to PathOfExile 1's crafting bench, because there is actually a replacement for that system, and it's going to be something that will help you when you find yourself in a particular scenario. So imagine this, you've got an amulet, this amulet is providing you with all of the strength that you need in order to equip your gear. Or perhaps this amulet is providing you with all the fire resistance you need in order to cap out your resistances. Then you get a much better amulet, but it doesn't have this one critical stat you want. Well, in PathOfExile 1, the solution would be to use Helena's crafting bench to make up for the stat you needed. Maybe you can't craft strength onto the amulet, but you can onto your shield. Maybe you do that. Maybe you get fire resistance somewhere else. Now, in PathOfExile 1, using Helena's crafting bench absolutely required you to have an empty suffix on the item if you wanted to craft on an attribute, or if you wanted to craft on a resist, or an empty prefix if you wanted to craft on life. PathOfExile 2 also turns that requirement on its head as well. Now in PathOfExile 2, the crafting bench is not going to exist, but something new will. And this is about fixing issues with your character through the use of runes. Runes and sockets are the new system, replacing the old crafting bench. What runes will do is they'll add one additional modifier. It'll often be a simple stat like 12% increased cold resistance, or some amount of flat elemental damage to attacks. And these runes will tell you what they do on them. So I'll put a couple of them on the screen now so you can have a look at what some of them will look like. To the best of our knowledge, there are 10 types that can drop by the end of Act 3, and who knows if there's more than that in the endgame. But not every item can have one of these runes socketed into it by default. Ordinarily, chest armor and two-handed martial weapons can have up to 2 item sockets. One-handed martial weapons, gloves, helmets, and boots, they can have up to 1. Now, prior to release, we kind of suspect shields can, but I've actually not seen any absolute confirmation one way or the other. We also know that caster weapons, that is scepters, that is wands, and that is spellcaster-oriented staves, they cannot have these sockets put into them, at least at the moment. Who knows whether they'll be added in the future. Okay, so what about later in the game? Soul cores are the endgame version of runes. Soul cores are simply runes, but more interesting and potentially better, but they're also something that you can't use super early in the game. So you can socket soul cores into the same item sockets that you could socket a rune into, but you're just not going to have access to these soul cores until you've played through the game for a while. They function like runes, but they have more exotic modifiers and typically more powerful ones. To give a couple of examples of really cool ones, you can get Increased Spirit, which is a spiritual successor, pardon the pun, to PathOfExile 1's mana reservation efficiency mechanic. This will allow you to reserve more spirit in order to power enduring buffs, and therefore have more enduring buffs on your character. Or alternately, you could get increased item rarity boosts, which are a pretty big deal from what we can see in PathOfExile 2. Now, when these soul cores give you a basic statistic, something like elemental damage with attacks, they're often but not always better than runes that give that same stat. Now, while you can circumvent this by trading with other players, by default you're only going to be able to acquire these soul cores from doing PathOfExile 2's Trials of Chaos. If you're a PathOfExile 1 player, you'll recognize these as a spiritual successor to the ultimatum mechanic, but if you're not a PathOfExile 1 player, this will be a mechanic that will be introduced to you at some point, probably around Act 3. It's something you'll engage with an easier version of first, but there is an endgame version, and that's where you're going to get the soul cores from. Now, you can add sockets to items as well. Most items are going to drop without sockets, that's the default, but sometimes you get a bit lucky and an item will drop with 1 or more sockets in it. So when you do get one of these, you can break it down at one of the disenchanting NPCs. They won't give you a full Artificer's Orb for it, but they will give you a 10th of one, an Artificer's Shard. Collect 10 of these shards in your inventory at once, they'll just automatically turn into an Artificer's Orb for you. Now, this orb will allow you to improve an already good item by adding a socket to it. And then later, when you've got the right rune that you want to use or the right soul core you want to use, you'll be able to upgrade that item further, fill that socket with something that is a boost to your character. Now, I mentioned there is a limit of 1 socket in most item slots and 2 in 2 particular slots. You can get an extra socket beyond this, but it is a huge risk and it's one that might destroy your item. Sometimes when you apply a Vaal orb to an item, this will increase the number of sockets. Now, this will permanently ban you from doing almost all other forms of crafting on that item, so it's a last step in the process, and additionally, it'll also have a chance of completely ruining the item in various ways as well. Is it worth it? That's up to you. I would say the answer is usually no, but sometimes there'll be the exception to it. Anyways, these Vaal Orb added sockets allow to exceed the usual maximum. So instead of 1 socket max, it's 2. Instead of 2 sockets max, it's 3. But there's a lot of RNG involved in getting that extra power. Is it worth it? Make up your own mind on that. But early on, I'd say the answer is probably no. Now, as of launch day, it's really important to know it is irrevocable when you socket a rune into an item. Socketing a rune or a soul core cannot be taken back. You cannot empty that socket again so that you could choose to put a different rune or soul core in there, and you cannot recover that rune or soul core. This means that on the very, very best items, you're going to want to think twice, think 3 times, think long and hard before you commit any of these additional runes in there, because it might mean that you end up sacrificing some potential to make the item even better in the future when you get a better soul core. However, in the early game, I want to encourage you to just use runes, use soul cores if you happen to come across one, in order to solve problems you've got right now. Do this so that you can continue progressing through the game, because you will get better items than the ones that you start out the game with. I'm going to leave it there. Hopefully that's a useful little tip for you in getting your resistances in order and in solving other little attribute problems you might have early in the game. May your Vaal Orbs have interesting results.